I still remember the sound of his voice that night. It wasn't angry or loud, just quiet and broken, and when he said, "How could you?" something inside me shattered. My son had caught me cheating on his father, and in that instant, I saw the exact moment a child's faith dies. I wish I could say it was an accident or a misunderstanding, but it wasn't. I used to be a good woman, a devoted wife to Daniel, and a loving mother to our only boy, Liam. For years our home felt warm, ordinary, safe, but over time that comfort turned into silence. And silence turned into a kind of loneliness I didn't know how to admit. I started craving the version of myself I'd lost somewhere between school runs and dinner dishes, the version who laughed, who felt desired, who mattered. So when someone came along who looked at me like I was still alive, I let the line blur. It started with harmless messages, then long lunches, then lies I told myself were small. I convinced myself Daniel would never understand, that I deserved to feel something again. It went on for months before that Thursday night when the rain pressed against the kitchen windows and I thought I was safe because Daniel was away and Liam had football practice. I remember the scent of wine, the low music, the warmth of hands that weren't my husband's, and then the click of the front door. A few footsteps, then silence. I turned and saw him standing there, backpack half slipped from his shoulder, eyes wide but already hardening as he understood. I didn't move. He didn't speak. He just turned away, and the sound of him leaving was louder than any scream. I chased him into the rain, barefoot, calling his name, but he didn't look back. In that moment, I realized I hadn't only betrayed my husband, I had destroyed my son's idea of who I was. When he came home hours later, soaked and pale, I wanted to fall at his feet and beg, but shame twisted into anger, and what came out of my mouth was cruel and defensive. I told him I wished he would just disappear. The second I said it, I saw something die in his eyes, and I knew there was no taking it back. He didn't yell or cry. He just walked away again, leaving the house hollow and unfamiliar. I thought I'd fix it in the morning, find the words to explain, but when morning came, his room was empty. He'd left a note on his pillow, a single sentence that still echoes every night when I close my eyes. "I'll make it easy for you, Mom." The morning he disappeared was so quiet it felt unnatural, like the house itself was holding its breath. His bed was perfectly made, no clothes missing, no sound of movement, just that one note that read, "I'll make it easy for you, Mom." At first, I thought maybe he'd gone to school early, but when the hours passed and his phone went straight to voicemail, the panic started to bloom in my chest. I drove around the neighborhood until the fuel light blinked, checking the park, his friends' houses, the football field, nothing. When I finally called Daniel, my voice was shaking, and I couldn't bring myself to tell him the truth. I said, Liam had stormed out after an argument, that I didn't know why. Daniel came home that night, exhausted and furious, his eyes searching mine for answers I wasn't ready to give. We called the police, filed a missing person report, handed them his photo, and they promised to look, but I could see the quiet pity in their faces. "Teenagers run away all the time," they said. "They always come back." But the nights turned into weeks, and Liam didn't come back. Every morning I sat at the kitchen table staring at my phone, waiting for a call, a message, anything. I'd replay that night in my head over and over, the rain, the door, the look in his eyes, and those words I'd thrown at him like a curse. I wished he would disappear, and then he did. The guilt was a constant ache, sitting behind my ribs, making it hard to breathe. Daniel started sleeping on the couch, saying he couldn't look at me without thinking of Liam's face that night. I couldn't blame him. I couldn't look at myself either. I told him eventually that Liam had caught me cheating, but I didn't tell him about the words I said afterward. That was my private punishment, the part too cruel to confess even to the man I'd betrayed. Friends stopped calling after a while, neighbors avoided eye contact, and whispers started following me everywhere I went. The mother who cheated, the boy who ran away. I could hear it in the grocery aisles, feel it in the way people pretended not to stare. I kept hoping every knock on the door would be Liam, but every time it was just silence, or another officer asking the same questions. Daniel began to pull further away until even his silence turned cold. I'd find him sitting in the living room, staring at Liam's football trophies, his face hollow. One night he finally said it. He asked me if the affair had been worth it. I didn't answer. What was I supposed to say? That it was never about love, just a desperate attempt to feel something before realizing I'd ruined everything that mattered? He walked away that night and didn't come home for 2 days. When he did, something in him was different. He moved around the house like a guest, barely speaking, avoiding me completely. The police eventually downgraded the case to a voluntary runaway. The news cycle forgot. Life went on around me like nothing had happened, but inside everything had stopped. I started visiting the places Liam used to go, the football field, the little pier by the lake, the diner where he liked those cheap pancakes. I'd sit there for hours, hoping I'd see him walk in, older, angry, but alive. Instead, I saw my reflection in the window, hollow-eyed and aging too fast. Nights were the worst. I'd lie awake imagining where he was, if he was safe, if he hated me as much as I hated myself. Some nights I thought I could hear him upstairs, the creak of floorboards, the faint hum of his music. But it was just my guilt playing tricks on me. It's strange how a home can still look the same while everything inside it rots. Daniel eventually stopped wearing his wedding ring. I stopped pretending I had a reason to get out of bed. We became two ghosts haunting the same house, bound together by the boy we both lost in different ways. The months after Liam disappeared blurred into each other like a never-ending winter, cold and gray and heavy with silence. Daniel stopped talking to me almost entirely, and I stopped expecting him to. Every conversation that did happen turned into an argument, even over the smallest things, the dishes, the mail, the police reports gathering dust on the counter. He started spending more nights at work than at his brother's place, and soon it felt like I was the only living thing in that house. I filled my days with pointless routines, cleaning, folding, staring out the window, because if I stopped moving, the guilt would consume me. Sometimes I'd catch myself dialing Liam's number just to hear the voicemail. His recorded voice saying, "Hey, it's Liam. Leave a message," became the only thing that reminded me he existed. I'd whisper into the phone, apologizing, begging him to come home, promising I'd make things right, but I always hung up before the beep. The police eventually called to say they had no new leads. They asked if there had been tension at home, if I'd said anything that could have upset him. I lied. I told them he'd been moody, like most teenagers, nothing more. I couldn't bring myself to admit that the last words I ever said to my son were that I wished he would disappear. Daniel must have sensed the truth anyway. He never said it outright, but the way he looked at me, empty, disgusted, tired, said everything. One night, months later, he finally asked if there was something I wasn't telling him. I said no, but the lie came out too fast, too rehearsed. He just nodded, turned away, and I think that was the moment our marriage truly ended, even if we still shared the same roof. He stopped sleeping in our bed altogether, and I started sleeping in Liam's room instead, surrounded by the smell of his old clothes and the dust settling on trophies he'd never collect again. I found a photograph under his pillow once. Me, Daniel, and Liam at the beach years ago. My smile in that picture looked so effortless, it felt like a stranger's face. I started to dream about him, not in peaceful ways, but in flashes. Him standing in the rain again, or turning to look at me with that same expression of disbelief. Every time I woke up, my chest felt like it was caving in. I stopped eating, stopped answering calls, and eventually stopped going outside altogether. Daniel moved out officially 6 months after Liam vanished. He left a note on the kitchen table saying he couldn't live in a place built on lies. I didn't even cry when I read it. I just sat there for hours staring at the imprint of his wedding ring, still visible on the paper where he'd pressed too hard. After he left, I thought I'd hit the bottom. But guilt has no bottom. It just keeps digging. I started seeing Liam everywhere. A boy on a bus with his same haircut, a shadow walking down the street in the same jacket, laughter in a store that sounded like his, Every time I'd follow, hoping, praying, but it was never him. I became that woman people cross the street to avoid, muttering to herself, chasing ghosts. My mother begged me to move back with her, but I couldn't. I couldn't leave in case Liam ever came home. I couldn't bear the thought that he'd knock on the door and find no one there. So I stayed, trapped between the past and the punishment I'd built for myself, surrounded by the memory of a boy who once looked at me like I was his whole world, and now probably wished I wasn't in it at all. It was almost 10 years later when I finally heard his name again. I'd gotten used to the silence by then, to living like a ghost inside a house that didn't feel like mine. I worked part-time at a small thrift store in town, mostly sorting donations, pretending I was still part of the world. One rainy afternoon, I was unpacking a box of clothes when I found a small blue hoodie with a patch on the sleeve. The exact kind Liam used to wear when he was 12. My hands froze. It was impossible, I told myself, but then I saw the tag inside, my handwriting faint but still there. Liam H. My knees buckled. I don't remember falling, just the sound of my own breath breaking. I called the police, desperate, wild, telling them I thought it meant something, but they told me it was probably just coincidence. Still, I couldn't stop shaking. That night I searched every missing persons forum I could find. I typed his name into search bars until my fingers ached. And then I saw it. A post from a social worker in another city about a young man found years ago with no ID, no family, no memory of who he was. The photo was grainy, taken in a hospital hallway, but the eyes, God, they were his. Older, tired, scarred maybe, but they were his. My hands trembled as I called the number, voice barely working. They told me he'd been found wandering near the coast, dehydrated, malnourished, and silent. He refused to speak for months. They said he'd been placed in a community home, quiet, gentle, mostly kept to himself. When they said his name, it wasn't Liam anymore. It was Eli. I drove all night to the address they gave me, through the kind of storm that feels biblical. The closer I got, the more terrified I became, not of seeing him, but of what I'd see in his eyes. Would he remember me? Would he hate me? Would he tell me to leave? When I finally arrived, dawn was breaking. The air smelled like wet soil and sea salt. I walked into the courtyard and saw him sitting on a bench, sketching something in a small notebook. He looked up, and for a moment, time just stopped. His eyes met mine, and I swear the world went quiet. He didn't speak, didn't smile, didn't move, just looked at me the way he had that night so many years ago, when everything fell apart. I wanted to fall to my knees, to beg, to say I'm sorry 1,000 times. But before I could open my mouth, he closed the notebook, stood up slowly, and said softly, "You really stayed." I didn't understand at first, but then he added, "I used to dream you'd still be there. I thought you'd move on." Tears blurred everything as I stepped closer, afraid to touch him. "I never moved on," I whispered. "I never could." He nodded once, not forgiving, not accusing, just existing, a man built from the wreckage of a boy I destroyed. We sat there in silence until the sun broke through the clouds. He didn't say he forgave me. I didn't ask him to. But when he reached into his pocket and handed me a photo, the same beach picture I'd found years ago, I knew that maybe, just maybe, some small part of him still remembered the version of me who loved him before the lies. As I held that picture, the wind carried the faint scent of rain, and for the first time in a decade, I let myself cry. Not for forgiveness, but for the chance to finally feel human again.